What's up, nerds? I'm Wes.
I'm Tom.
I used to think that the Vital Lacerda games I played were really heavy and brain burnery, and then I played this one.
So just get this out in the open. I do enjoy Vital Lacerda games. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself like a fanboy, and I haven't played all of his games. I still have yet to play The Gallerist and Vinhos, and also CO2, which actually I think I'm gonna play it pretty soon. Me and a group of friends have a deal where we're gonna play it before I move. So I can't rank this against every Vital Lacerda game, but there you go.
And I've even played a few less of his games than Tom has, but I can say this is probably one of the heavier of his games. It still has that very Vital Lacerda feel of everything blends together and it all makes sense. It's not necessarily super overly complicated for complicated's sake. There's just a lot of stuff going on.
See our review of Feudum for that.
There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of things to keep track of. There's a lot of ooh, I want to do this. But in order to do that, I have to come over here and do this first. But before I can do this, I have to come over here and do that. And then I have to make sure that I'm in the right stage of the game, because you can go back and forth between orbit and then on the planet. And I have to manage my resources and then get my technology up to the right place that I can even start that whole process. Mm-hmm. So everything you do really needs to be thought out and planned. There's not a lot of being impulsive. You can't just let's just see what's available this turn and kind of go from there.
You can't really shoot from the hip and be like, ooh, wait, I changed my mind. I'm going to now try and go for this instead. And obviously, do not use this video as an explanation of how the game works. Yeah. Paul Grogan, the super awesome gaming rules guy, has a really wonderful how to play video, so you should definitely check that out. But just to give you the briefest of overviews, it's mostly like an action selection game, really. I mean, there are some of the actions that you select kind of feel like worker placement, because you do have these little, essentially, workers that you do place over on the action. But it's almost a little bit more than that, because, again, those workers, those are only used for that thing and for you can actually boost actions. So they aren't specifically just workers, those little astronaut guys you have. And they're also, scoring at the end, so you can get more of them. But yeah, you just pick one action you're going to do, and you can also do a second action from your board that you can burn crystals to do, and that's it. And then when we go over the actions, actually, I don't even know how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's only 10 different actions. It can't be that much, can it? Well, I remember when I was teaching the game to Wes, I was like, okay, so we just went through this half of the board, right? Okay, do you feel like you get that? He's like, yeah, okay, I think I get that. I'm like, cool. We are 10% of the way through.
The premise of the game is we are trying to colonize Mars, terraform Mars. It's not really terraforming, because we're building these little complexes to produce
we're building
resources.
On top of it.
But there are two main sections of the main board where it's in orbit and on the surface. And in orbit is really resource collection and upgrading technologies and kind of gearing up to do stuff.
You get blueprints there too.
Yeah, and then you come down to the surface and you do a lot of your building and your upgrading and you're moving stuff around, and you this represents the whole complex, and you're trying to improve your entire complex, and you can get points for that. And so you're going back and forth between these two sides, but you don't just decide where you're going. There's this cool little rocket ship that's going back and forth, and every turn it moves, and at first it's just switching back and forth, and as the game progresses, it's taking longer and longer to switch back and forth, because it's instead of going 1, 1, 1.
Thematically, it's that as Mars becomes more self-sustaining, we don't need to send a shuttle back and forth as often. Except one of my friends was like, that's totally backwards. You think when there's more people on Mars, they won't want there to be more shuttles back and forth?
Anyway, so that's one of the first big clinch of the game, is figuring out, hey, the shuttle's about to leave. Do I want to get on it and go to the other side of the board? Because if I don't do it now, I can't just do it next turn, potentially. Or you can never do it the next turn. But further on in the game, it's if I don't do it now, it's going to be 6 turns before I can take it. So you have to make sure that when you do take the shuttle, you're geared up, you're prepared, you're ready to go. And then when you land, you want to make sure that you have enough stuff that you landed with too.
Which is why there are a few other ways to get across. You can burn a little ship here that you have in your hangar, and there's an action over on the orbit side that you can spend your whole turn just to go over to the other side. And that will bring me into my very first complaint. So, like Wes said, this side is mostly gearing up to do stuff, and that side is mostly doing stuff, doing the work, building the buildings and whatnot. And the fact that they are so separated was the kind of the only mechanic, really, that felt like complexity for complexity's sake. It very well may be a balancing type of issue of like, well, you want to be able to limit yourself on gathering these resources so much and you want to whatever. But also the fact that like, okay, when you go from orbit to colony or when you go from colony to orbit, those are two different like sequences that you do. They're not that different, but you do follow different steps going from one to the other or going from here to that, you know? And also the fact that you just said like when it spreads out more and more and more, that just makes it more pre-planning. And I think that's like the crux of why I don't like that mechanic. Like if like the fact that they're separated just feels like why, right? But then the fact that it forces you to pre-plan a whole bunch makes me go, oh, well then I don't really like it because, you know, I think that was one of the main reasons why I didn't like Anachrony. Also, it was like, oh, you need to prep your exosuits and make sure you have enough water. You know, like if you're one resource off, you know, like if I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have, when I could spend any resource to upgrade, I shouldn't have spent my oxygen, I should have spent my battery. Oh no. And then that screws all this whole turn, these whole 5 turns. How am I going to get back over there? How can I, you know, like that's the part that makes me go like, oh, I really wish this weren't here.
And it's really like, it's because it's the only thing it adds to the game. Like the only thing it does is just makes you plan more.
Right.
Like other things add complexity. It adds complexity, but you also get this reward, and it also can make this trigger over here, like this thing over here where you're trying to upgrade your station. Like
you're the LSS thing.
You could do the whole game without any of this stuff, but that would take away from some of the comboing and some of the strategizing.
You're right. You're right. Like that adds complexity, but it adds rewards to the complexity. But there are a lot of that. There's a lot of rewards. There's a lot of like so that the tokens that you put out there that you can pick up with your rover.
Yeah.
So it's not a tight game necessarily. There are a surprising amount of, you know, flexibility in, you know, like that example. Oh no, I shouldn't have spent my battery. I should have spent my this. Well, you probably can remedy that. But now this plan that I sat here for 4 turns to try and make sure I do my plan, I have to try and reevaluate, you know, and also, but it's like it's possible, but it's harder to do that because I can't just be like, all right, I guess this turn I'll gather more resources and the next turn I'll go and do the thing I wanted to do last turn. You know, it's just the type of thing that I tend to not like in games in general. And when it's in a really heavy game, that's when I go like, no, this is the worst time to have that.
But to be fair, it is still a very smooth, heavy game. Like for big, crunchy, heavy games, I did feel a little bit like when you get it, you get it. And it still takes a lot of thought. Don't play it first thing in the morning during your first cup of coffee.
Right.
Like we did. But it's still like a really cool game. And it, like thematically, it makes a bunch of sense. It's fun to like watch your colony grow and try to combo things, and it's not like super cutthroat, but there could be a little bit of like
especially the worker placement actions.
Yeah,
have that.
I don't know. I liked it. It was a fun game. I'm happy to play it again, but it is a game of the caliber that you have to like plan for. You have to start your planning with when are we going to get together with enough time to learn the game and play the game.
Yeah, this is like an entire evening, especially for your first game with teach and everything. Especially if you're playing 3 or 4 players, it's going to be the entire evening. Whenever we talk about games that are this heavy, I always feel like they you know, float in a different category. Like if I were to just rank games, you know, like what's my top 10, how much do I really like that? Games like this, and I also guess I kind of go the other end of the spectrum too, where like really, really small games always have like a caveat. It's like, it's really good for a really heavy game, or it's really good for a light game because I have to be in the mood for those types of games. Anything that falls right in the median, I'm always in the mood for, right? And you are correct when you say that, like, look, it still has the Vital Lacerda. Like, the reason why he's so famous and people like his games isn't because there's tons of people out there who love heavy games. It's because there's tons of people out there who learned to love heavy games because of how everything integrates like this. You know, like the way that, okay, well, I need to build more of these shelters out there so I can hold more people. And that'll also let me hold more resources. And then I want to, since now that I can hold more resources, I can build more buildings. Well, actually, in order to build buildings, I need to have the tech up at a certain level. And in order to advance, I need to get more resources. Well, if I build more buildings, that'll help me get more resources also, so I could do that. Or, you know what? I need to jump back over to orbit, so maybe I should burn one of these ships. You know, actually, I wish I could have another ship, but I need to build buildings before I can get ships, you know? It does feel a little bit, so not restrictive. Yeah, maybe restrictive.
It just is. There is a path to do everything, but most things take a few steps to get there.
Yeah, well, there's paths. There's lots of paths, but everything is limited. There's an awful lot of limiters. You know, you can't just pick one path and go crazy because they're so integrated. Lots of these paths stop other paths. You know what I mean? It's not just like, what's his name? Castles of Burgundy. Stefan Feld, where you could just mostly just pick one thing and kind of go ham on it. And here you kind of have to do everything at least a little bit in order to do one thing really well. But this is, probably one of the most complex of his that I've played. And it's actually not my favorite. Like, I still like it. It's still clearly well designed. I still ultimately have fun when I'm playing it. But I think Kanban is probably still my favorite of his games. Just like because mechanically it still just makes the most sense. It's so just straightforward of, you place a work, you have one, it's worker placement. It really falls into the category of worker placement. You place one worker on this time track. The first, if you place here, you get to do an action here. You place here, you get to do an action here. You place here, you get to do an action here. There's only 2 spots per action space. The one on the left, you get to do the action less, but you get to do it first. The one on the right, you get to do the action second, but you get to do it more. That right there, I just explained to you the basic mechanics of the game. At the beginning of this video, when we said, okay, so it's kind of like action selection, but some of them have like a worker placement things, and here you gain resources, and there you do all the stuff. That isn't as smooth, and I didn't really explain to you what you do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I definitely feel like with a lot of people, and you definitely fall into the category, that like when games get heavier and heavier, you start to get diminishing return. It's like there's like basic games, and then like, oh my gosh, these games are awesome, and then it's like, it's getting harder, and it's like, what's the point now? Like, is it improving the game at that point? And again, this is an awesome game, and there's a lot of really awesome stuff going, but I think what you're kind of getting at is the amount of complexity, does it improve the game that much? And again, some people, that's what they want. They want that complexity. They want just the brain burnery, I'm going to think, and I'm going to outthink you. And it's not necessarily I'm going to outplay you, but it's I'm going to outplan you.
Well, let's say if we cleaned up this, so that obviously the biggest complaint I have is the ship thing. So if we were to clean that up, right, either remove it completely, or I'm certain we can't just remove it completely. We would have to do something to mitigate something, whatever. But if that were fixed, and you didn't really have to worry about that to that same degree, do you think like the game would be lacking? You know what I mean? Be like, oh, I wish there was more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess not. And it might be even if if it was always just back and forth, it didn't go farther and farther out.
Maybe.
Because it was the punishing part of when you made the wrong choice. Either I jumped on the ship before I should, or I messed up over here and didn't get the resource I needed. So now I'm either going back now, not able to do what I need to do, or spend a whole bunch more turns in orbit waiting to get the thing that I was trying to get. Like, that can be really punishing. And again, it's not just you have to plan, it's if you plan poorly or you don't plan perfectly, everything falls apart.
Well, to the game's credit, it's not necessarily, I would kind of disagree with the term everything falls apart, because there are, again, you can bob and weave a little bit. Again, like if the tokens that come out there and you can do things for cheaper, spending these crystals to take, you can still take stuff from the depot. So there are ways around it, especially if you start upgrading your board and then, hey, I can get a mineral. Yeah. Minerals are wild. There is a little bit of wiggle room. So it's not purely punishing, but definitely not enough to where you don't have to really, really think about this. And I know we're harking on this part of the game, and there's still so much more to think about. Like, okay, scientists, those are kind of funky. Like, I like them, but okay, they're mostly just endgame points for the number of buildings, but it's like the resources you spend to get them is different from the type of card that they will trigger, and it's also different from the type of building that they will get points off of, you know? Like, those types of things I'm always kind of like, but like, why? You know?
Like, I get maybe it forces you to diversify because you
Right.
can't just like, I'm going for batteries, this is the battery scientist, he's objectively better for me. It's, we're going for batteries, so it's going to be a lot easier to buy the hydrologist, which is the water scientist, but the water scientist wants to go on a plant building to go water those plants. But you don't even have to have that plant building. You can put your scientist on your opponent's building and start activating, because at the end of the day, like, we're not fighting on Mars because we're all trying to build this colony together, but you want to be in charge of the best part of it. So, like, but that's the level of complexity, is go for batteries to buy the scientist to get the water one, so that you can put the water one on your opponent's plant one and then or your own plant one if you don't put it wherever you want.
Well, there was even in your explanation there that you made a mistake because you said the term building. So the tile, placing a tile is building a building. Every player has these, over here, has these little things. I grabbed one right there.
One right there.
Oh, God. Has these little things that straight up look like buildings. But that's upgrading a building, right? You get a blueprint to upgrade a building. It's just, in your first few games, confusion is gonna happen because there's a lot of things that don't seem super intuitive right off the bat. Because you said, like, that happens every game. Every time we've ever talked about this, we've always said buildings referring to this, not referring to this, not referring to this little thing that totally looks like a building, not referring to this tile that looks like a tile. You know what I mean? And it's, you get a blueprint to upgrade the building. Now it has a special ability that you can either trigger by spending 2 crystals from your board or by just placing a scientist on there, which now makes that ability free until that scientist moves. It's, again, still like it. It sounds like we're harking on it because in the Vitalis sort of line, this isn't my favorite and it's not the cleanest. Now, again, I've heard Vino's is still his most complex. Maybe it's at this level. Maybe it's more. I don't know. But I still feel like Kanban and especially Escape Plan were more, the times when I had to stumbled and went, oh, wait, I did that wrong, or I didn't really understand this rule, or how exactly did this work? The times when that happened in those other games were much less. And sure, Escape Plan was less complex, but Kanban was still pretty heavy. Kanban was still like, when I was learning it, I was like, oh my gosh. But then walking away from it, I was like, that wasn't that bad. And I mean, in all of the games, they're like that, right? You're like crazy at first, but then afterwards you're like, oh, it's just, gather resources and build the stuff, right?
You definitely need to have like a learning game though. Like it's like, hey, we're going to play a game that the whole purpose of this is for you to figure out what's going on. And then once you figure it out, then you can play. Because it's going to be your first few rounds of, I go here, that triggers what again? And I go here, that triggers, maybe we're just idiots. I don't know.
I just want to make sure I'm hammering home that it's not the level of complexity that I dislike, right? It's not like, oh, Tom just doesn't like big games or he's not into really heavy games.
Exactly,
I feel like, I feel like this one doesn't do heavy quite as well as the other ones go. Like, at least right now, just off the top of my head, it would probably be for me Kanban, Lisboa, maybe Escape Plan, and then this. This might be my least favorite. I mean, Escape Plan I didn't love. It wasn't as, it was kind of undersold, right? It was like, oh, it's gonna be so heavy, and then it's like, oh, okay. It's like a little disappointing. But I don't know. Maybe I need to play it more, but like, I don't know. I still liked it. It's probably at like a 6 for me,
So I do want to mention one mechanic that it's probably one of my favorite mechanics that was really clever in here. And it's your work. You can get more workers as the game goes on, but you're limited to how many workers you can have by this. Like, there's a spot for them to go, and every worker needs its own spot. So when you recall the workers, you need to make sure you have a spot for all of them, and if you don't, they die off. However, you only recall your workers when you return to the area that those workers are in. So like my workers that are in orbit, when I leave orbit, they all stay in orbit until I return to orbit. So if I'm full and all my workers are out there and I leave, that's fine as long as I don't have any workers on the surface. But then if I know, I've only got 4 slots and I have 4 workers in orbit, I either need to build some more of these buildings to open up more spots for the workers to go, or I need to make sure that I spend all of these workers on the surface so that when I go back to orbit, I have space for all of those workers up there. I thought that was one of those mechanics that, like, it's a heavier mechanic because it's more than just, like, make sure I have enough spots for all my workers. But it was clever because there's a way to manipulate. There's a way to say, ooh, I can have 8 workers or more than that even with limited spots as long as I don't recall them until I have space for them.
Yeah, it's not just have space for the workers, it's have space for the workers at the right time that you would need it.
That I thought was super clever. I really liked that mechanic in the game.
Yeah, that is clever. You know, I like the ships thing. I love advancing the tech. Even the blueprints giving you more abilities. They give you you could take a blueprint that gives you a resource if that resource isn't in the depot. You know, like there are a lot of cool things here. It's almost like, okay, yeah, sure. I thought X-Men Apocalypse was awesome, but I also know that X-Men Days of Future Past exists, and I also know that Avengers Endgame exists. So this is great, but there are things that are even greater in that same category. So
I also know that Wolverine exists. The bad one with the bad Deadpool.
Yeah, right. That's Origins. Yeah, that's stupid. It's so stupid. We should have been talking about Mars movies. Okay. I mean, I know the Colin Farrell Total Recall exists, but the Arnold Schwarzenegger Total Recall exists. So, like, yeah. Actually, the Colin Farrell one was terrible anyways.
At the end of the day, we did ultimately like this game. And when we say it's our least favorite of the Vital games we've played, that doesn't mean, like, we don't like it. It just means, like, on a sliding scale of pizza places.
We don't need any more analogies.
I did really enjoy it. It is a heavy, crunchy, brain burnery game that you have to, like, psych yourself up to play, prepare for it, like, make sure you eat a lot of, like, eat well that day to get your brain going. Don't play first thing in the morning. But if that's what you want, that's what you're looking for, this one definitely hits the nail on the head. It's super well produced, as most of Evil Griffin's games are.
So if you're looking for a heavy game, in the description box down below, we will put a purchase link to On Mars, and maybe I'll also put a purchase link to Kanban or something, because I will say, I'm going to recommend
Apocalypse.
I'm going to recommend Kanban first. Honestly, if you don't have any of Vital's games, I probably do think you should start with, well, maybe you want to start with Escape Plan because it's easier. But if you really want to jump into a heavy game, I think Kanban is his best right now. Vinhos and the Gallerist aside, you know, notwithstanding, because I haven't played those yet.
Yeah. Either way, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you'll never be bored.
See, it's times like this where I wish we did, like, clickbaity titles so I could put, like, On Mars, Vital's worst game with the question mark, and then we would, like, hate click, like, no, you don't know!